The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
the Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, the Florida Council of Arts and Culture, and the state of Florida. Mary McLeod Bethune was a larger-than-life activist whose legacy is now remembered with an 11-foot-tall, 6,000-pound statue carved by Nilda Comas. She used the last piece of statuary marble taken from the same Italian quarry used by Renaissance artist Michelangelo. This statue of Mary McLeod Bethune will be on permanent display in the United States Capitol building in Washington, D.C., representing the state of Florida. Welcome to Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. I'm Ben Brokmarkle. Mary McLeod Bethune was born to formerly enslaved parents and was the first in her family to be born free. In 1904, she founded a school here in Daytona Beach that would become Bethune-Cookman University. She was an educator and advisor to U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt and an active proponent of racial equality.
There was nothing happening in America that had to do with the advancement, the struggle for equality of Black people, where Mary McLeod Bethune was not there.
Mary McLeod was born in 1875 on a plantation near Maysville, South Carolina.
Maysville is a small hamlet. It is in one of the areas of the Cotton Belt of South Carolina, a very retrograded area.
Her mother and her grandmother set the tone for her. They inculcated in her the sense of pride.
Her parents, Sam and Patsy McLeod, they were enslaved people. It is said that Mary McLeod, when she was 9, could pick 250 pounds of cotton in a day.
Someone saw her intellectual ability and gave her a scholarship to leave that area and move up higher in education.
Mary McLeod's scholarship enabled her to attend Scotia Seminary in North Carolina from 1888 to 1894. In 1895, she attended and graduated from Moody Bible Institute in Chicago. After teaching at schools in Savannah, Georgia, and Palatka, Florida, she came to Daytona, where she opened the Daytona Educational and Industrial School for Negro Girls in 1904.
With 5 little girls, $1.50 that she raised from selling sweet potato pies and boiled eggs, she was able to create her first school.
She cared most deeply about children, especially Black children, during a period at the turn of the century when Black people were still just getting used to their freedom and needing so many things. Of course, the Black community was there, ready for their children to be educated.
Mrs. Bethune is teaching a very different kind of education. It's not about assimilation to the dominant society. It's about transforming that society, and for the first time ever, making it into a democratic polity where all people are respected.
When you talk about Mary McLeod Bethune and the way she was able to navigate the racial waters of the South, you're looking at someone who really understood the mind of a Southerner. They're willing to open up part of the pie for African Americans, as long as African Americans don't ask for too large of a slice.
Bethune was able to grow a school in a hostile environment because she had influential whites, both men and women, supporting her.
James Gamble of Procter & Gamble, she asked him to be on the board of trustees, and he said, a board of trustees of what? And she says, it's a dream. Starting in 1904, he was the chair of her board of trustees. He brought other people in. So she was able to develop relationships with people across boundaries.
And she carried herself in such a way that there were no barriers or boundaries for her. And I think both black and white alike were actually taken by that. No one had ever seen anything or anybody like that.
In her calm and easy way, she made the people in Daytona understand that Bethune-Cookman was something special.
Most interesting was how quickly the college evolved from nothing to, by 24, it's a junior college.
Even though society looked down upon people who were dark-skinned, and Bethune was very dark-skinned, she did not let that stop her.
When she walked into that auditorium, she says, "Stand up, you little black boys and girls." She was trying to instill in us that black was not dirty. It was okay to be black.
The students at the college were so impressive. When you would see them move about the community, you would know them by their dress.
They were highly respected because they could sit on the benches down there and wait for the bus, and we couldn't.
They had a community meeting at the college on Sunday afternoons.
And this is where she invited John D. Rockefeller and the White Sewing Machine Company.
It was the only place in Daytona Beach where interracial groups could meet freely, was on the campus of Bethune-Cookman University. Mary McLeod Bethune did that.
She would tell her board of trustees very clearly, again, when they came to campus, look, you have to sit with the Negro citizenry here.
And John D. Rockefeller might be sitting right next to his gardener.
This was eye-opening. It said that black people were just as good as white people, just having desegregated seating, which was against the law of Florida.
When women acquired the right to vote in 1920, Bethune redoubled her efforts to enfranchise blacks. Those efforts were met with resistance from the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan was a formidable organization during the 1920s and for a brief time controlled both Daytona's and Volusia County's government.
She believed in the right to vote and risked her own life to get black people to vote.
Becoming politically aware, participating in the mainstream of American life was a major priority.
The Ku Klux Klan had come to her campus, and they had made it clear that what she was doing in encouraging African American people to vote had to stop. They would have no more of it. She gathered the teachers. It was near nightfall. And she said, "Tonight is a good night for the choir to practice."
And then Mrs. Bethune ordered the staff to flood the campus with lights. And this just seemed to upset the KKK because all of a sudden they're the ones being watched. And so they're in full light now and they're not as scary. And they just all turned around and left.
She believed in a God who she said would protect her, including putting her own life in danger in the interest of her people.
Through the 1910s, 1920s, and 1930s, Bethune became increasingly prominent among this country's top black leaders. She joined, founded, and led numerous civil rights and black advocacy organizations, always seizing opportunities to combat racism and promote democracy.
Remember the motto of the National Association of Colored Women, lifting as we climb. She's literally lifting people out of situations of impoverishment and 20th century slavery.
She was involved with many different organizations, the National Negro Congress, the NAACP. She worked with leaders of the Urban League.
That's what she did that nobody else did, can claim to do, because Black women did not have visibility in the national affairs of the United States until Mary McLeod Bethune came along.
She demanded that white people respect Black womanhood.
Of all of the horrific laws under Jim Crow, one of the most insidious of those laws was that Black and white people could not bathe in the same ocean.
When she worked with a few others to purchase Bethune Beach, the idea was that it would be a beach that people could come to, but it would also be a place that people could invest in.
It was a stretch of land there that the mosquitoes were so bad nobody wanted to get it.
The beach would be packed. We had lifeguards. We had everything that you would see practically, in Daytona Beach, with the exception of a real boardwalk.
This statue of Mary McLeod Bethune is representing Florida in the National Statuary Hall collection. Dr. Bethune herself was no stranger to Washington, D.C. as a close friend of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt and an advisor to the president. Bethune formed the Federal Council of Negro Affairs, which became known as Roosevelt's Black Cabinet. Bethune helped African Americans secure more citizenship rights and greater economic security with FDR's New Deal programs of the 1930s. Her impressive leadership skills were on full display as Bethune became, by the decade's end, the highest-ranking African American in the federal government and Black America's most effective advocate for racial justice.
She talked about the damage of segregation in Black communities. They didn't have paved roads. They didn't have lighted streets. They didn't have the same sanitation services, that white communities had.
She was on the picket line in 1937 in Washington, D.C., when they had signs saying, "Don't patronize People's Drugstore because they do not hire Black employees."
The most concrete change was her emphasis upon the many, many New Deal agencies hiring Black professionals.
When someone would say, well, there are no qualified Blacks for these positions, that she had a list of names that she could point to. Langston Hughes said that she wasn't like other Black leaders who gave in to Jim Crow.
Eleanor Roosevelt was very impressed with Mary McLeod Bethune. Mary McLeod Bethune was able to have intimate conversation with Eleanor Roosevelt. She was able to articulate what African Americans needed. They wanted to push the envelope on what women's rights were and social justice.
The fact that she and Eleanor Roosevelt were friends enabled us to get the NYA, the National Youth Administration program here.
She was Mrs. Mary Bethune. She was a woman at a time now when almost no other African American woman was a part of the Roosevelt administration.
When Dr. Bethune wanted to speak with President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, she would just pick up the phone and say, "Eleanor, I understand the president wishes to speak with me." And Eleanor Roosevelt would find her husband and say, "Franklin, I think you wish to speak with Mary." That relationship between those two women, a friendship between a Black and a white woman, opened the doors that allowed Mary McLeod Bethune to know President Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
In the mid-30s, there were about 50 different federal agencies that now had official Negro advisors. Mary Bethune's critical importance was as the head, the unofficial president of this group of Negro advisors that would meet regularly, most often at her own home.
There are very few people that I can think of that had anywhere near the level of influence that Mary McLeod Bethune had as an advisor to multiple U.S. presidents. My understanding is the only woman of color to be at the founding of the United Nations.
World War II presented huge opportunities to improve the lives of African Americans. The war meant jobs, and Bethune was determined that blacks received their fair share. Blacks were fighting and dying for their country, and Bethune constantly reminded the nation that African Americans had earned their right to equal citizenship. America could not honestly claim to be the world's arsenal of freedom and democracy while it denied basic freedoms to black citizens.
When German U-boats began prowling the east coast of Florida, the city fathers and mothers of Daytona Beach realized we are paralyzed. We are a tourist town now with no tourists. We are going to blow away like a tumbleweed. A woman in the community named Eileen Butts, a very prominent socialite, approaches Mary McLeod Bethune at the college and asks, could you help? She picks up the telephone and calls President Franklin D. Roosevelt. A few weeks later, a WAC base is coming to Daytona Beach. The WAC was a military unit for women. The idea was women were to take the place of men's jobs that weren't military. Mary McLeod Bethune insisted that African American women also be included.
All that, there were hundreds of them here, and which was a big boost to the economy because they spent a lot of money, so she was instrumental in that.
Ms. Bethune had a lot of overt influence, but she had a lot of covert influence. A lot of things that she would do behind the scenes. She embraced Jackie Robinson and those guys when they first came in 1946.
When Robinson was playing for the Montreal Royals, he broke the color line. When they went to Sanford, the mayor of Sanford came out and showed the city code that whites and blacks could not participate in interracial recreation game. They canceled the game there.
Dr. Bethune was instrumental in Jackie Robinson being the first African American to play professional baseball. And it was largely because of her spirit, her personality, and her insistence that allowed Jackie to play here in Daytona Beach.
Bethune's tireless efforts on behalf of African Americans resulted in considerable recognition and many great achievements, but her persistence took a toll on her family.
The relationship with her husband, it didn't work. She would not listen to her husband's notion that her ideas were not obtainable.
At the end of her life, in the last international speech that she gave in Switzerland, she apologized to her son.
And she felt as if she had been so busy raising everybody else's children that somehow she had neglected her own.
On May 18, 1955, Mary McLeod Bethune died of a heart attack in her home on the campus of what is now Bethune-Cookman University. More than 60 years later, the Florida legislature bestowed upon her its most prestigious honor.
The dialogue started after the massacre in Charleston, South Carolina, that there should be a replacement for the statue that resides in the U.S. Capitol currently today. That statue is Edmund Kirby Smith.
She replaces a Confederate general.
The statue of Mary McLeod Bethune will join the statues of 4 other preeminent African Americans in Statuary Hall: Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Rosa Parks, and Martin Luther King Jr. Bethune's statue will be the first in Statuary Hall to honor an African American who has been chosen by a state. Each state selects 2 statues to represent them in Statuary Hall. The other statue representing Florida is of inventor and scientist John Gorey, who made early advances in air conditioning and refrigeration. His statue was placed in the U.S. Capitol building in 1914.
I cannot think of a better way to express Dr. Bethune's beauty, her power, her strength, her eloquence, her dignity.
It's a living, breathing example of the push for women's rights, the push for equality.
Nilda Comas will be the first Hispanic master sculptor represented in Statuary Hall. That in itself, I think, is beautiful symbolism.
I see her there as a reminder, especially during these political times, that we are all in the same boat. We are all human beings. There is a oneness that God intends for us to have. And here it is, I'm reminding you of that.
Before heading to Washington, D.C., the statue of Mary McLeod Bethune was displayed in the Daytona Beach News-Journal Center, where nearly 15,000 people came to see it between mid-October and mid-December 2021.
As a double alumna of Bethune-Cookman University, I received my chemistry degree from there in 2000 and then recently a master's in education. And so for me to be a part of her legacy already and then to have this opportunity to make sure that others are able to be educated about her and to see her and just feel the likeness of her while they're here, it's just been a blessing for me.
Independent filmmaker Eric Breitenbach has partnered with historian Len Lempel for several documentaries about local history topics. They are currently working on a feature-length documentary film about Mary McLeod Bethune.
We started in 2019 because what we had learned with Hoppin' Rattlesnakes and the Jackie Robinson film was there's still a few people in the area that were alive when Bethune was here. And, you know, if you wait too long, some of those people aren't going to be around. So we wanted to get that done. The first series of interviews we did was what we call our elder interviews. And we interviewed 6 people, all in their late 80s, early 90s, about their recollections of Bethune. We segued from those interviews to scholar interviews. And then we're doing things like you saw today, where we're interviewing people at the statue. The statue, of course, is part of Bethune's story now, and we have been working with Nancy Lohman, Bob Lloyd, and the Bethune Statuary Fund to incorporate the story of the statue into the overall documentary as well.
People revered Mrs. Bethune because she cared about young black girls and their education, and she did more to bring young black girls into higher education than any other leader of her time.
She was a loyal American patriot who wanted this country to be as good as it could possibly be.
I think she saw what this country could become. It could become a more perfect union. And she made sure that the struggle, was never over.
I'm 91 years old, and I still have the Mary McLeod spirit in me right now. Just to hear her talking, and the way she carried herself. And it's a great lady.
The greatest battle is before us. The fight for a new America. Fearless, free, united, morally rearmed. This dream, this ideal, this aspiration, this is what American democracy means to me.
The statue of Mary McLeod Bethune will permanently reside in the heart of democracy at the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C., representing the state of Florida. Her legacy as an educator and civil rights activist also lives on here in Daytona Beach at the historically black college Bethune-Cookman University. You've been watching Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. Visit us anytime online at myfloridahistory.org. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ben Broke-Markle. The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
the historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
The Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, the Florida Council of Arts and Culture, and the state of Florida.